It happened while most people were asleep. In the dead of night, buses rolled in, floodlights lit up the desert sky, and entire migrant camps in New Mexico were emptied. By sunrise, every single person was gone, loaded into convoys and driven toward a fate they had no time to prepare for. What happened here isn't just another immigration raid, it's part of a much bigger operation that's transforming detention, deportation, and the very idea of due process in America. The overnight operation, residents of small New Mexico towns woke up to an eerie silence. The makeshift migrant encampments that had grown on the outskirts, once buzzing with activity, campfires, and the hum of generators, were suddenly gone. Law enforcement sources confirmed that U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, backed by Border Patrol units, state police, and even National Guard support, had carried out a coordinated sweep overnight. Witnesses described long lines of detainees being led away in shackles, some still half asleep, clutching what little they could carry. The operation was precise, with buses waiting at the edge of camp perimeters and agents moving in with military-style discipline. This wasn't a small-scale arrest. It was the complete dismantling of multiple sites in a single night. Sources inside ICE say these New Mexico camps had become a focal point for the administration's mass deportation drive, a campaign fueled by billions in newly approved funding. For weeks, surveillance drones, undercover vehicles, and unmarked vans monitored comings and goings. When the green light came, it took only hours to clear hundreds of men, women, and children. The bigger picture behind the sweep. This operation didn't happen in isolation. It's part of an unprecedented expansion of detention and deportation capacity across the United States. The Trump administration has been moving quickly to reopen and repurpose dozens of privately operated detention centers, striking billion-dollar contracts with major for-profit prison companies like GEO Group and CoreCivic. In February, ICE announced the reopening of Delaney Hall in Newark, New Jersey, a massive facility capable of holding around 1,000 detainees. In Texas, CoreCivic is bringing the South Texas Family Residential Center back online, a sprawling complex that can hold up to 2,400 people, including children. New Mexico is now firmly in the crosshairs, with multiple sites earmarked for expansion or new construction to handle the growing wave of arrests. Administration insiders point to the role of Trump's border advisor, Tom Homan, who has openly called for pushing ICE's detention capacity to 100,000 beds. The goal is to stage what the president has called the largest deportation operation in American history, targeting not only those with criminal records but also long-term residents without legal status. The money machine driving it all. A huge part of what made this overnight deportation possible is the staggering amount of new money flowing into immigration enforcement. On July 4th, President Trump signed into law a $170 billion budget package that supercharges ICE and Customs and Border Protection (CBP) operations through 2029. ICE alone will receive an additional $75 billion over the next 4 years, $45 billion of that specifically for detention, and $15 billion for deportation flights and ground operations. CBP gets another $65 billion, nearly $47 billion of which is earmarked for border wall construction. Vice President J.D. Vance didn't mince words when he said everything else in the bill was immaterial compared to the ICE money and immigration enforcement provisions. The sheer scale of this funding means ICE can now sustain mass raids like the one in New Mexico, move detainees across state lines, and even contract with facilities overseas, such as Guantanamo Bay in Cuba or El Salvador's notorious CSOT prison when domestic capacity runs out. The for-profit detention boom. Privately run detention is nothing new, but its current growth is staggering. Nearly 90% of all immigrants in ICE custody are now held in facilities operated by private companies. Critics say profit, not public safety, is driving the expansion. These facilities have long histories of controversy, overcrowding, poor medical care, unsanitary conditions, and allegations of abuse. Yet companies like GEO Group and CoreCivic are experiencing record profits, buoyed by guaranteed contracts that pay for a set number of beds whether they're filled or not. Between 2020 and 2023, the government paid roughly $160 million for empty detention beds nationwide. In New Mexico, new private detention projects are already in motion. Legislators in the state have debated banning private immigration detention entirely, but with federal jurisdiction over ICE facilities, local laws often fail to block these contracts. As one official put it, the federal government can still operate what it wants, where it wants, inside the camps before the raid. For weeks, conditions in the New Mexico camps had been deteriorating. Migrants, many from Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, were living in makeshift shelters relying on donated food and water. Local aid workers reported an increase in respiratory illnesses, skin infections, and malnutrition, especially among children. Rumors of an impending raid had circulated, but most dismissed them. In past years, ICE raids were targeted, arresting small numbers at a time. What happened here was different, an all-out clearance, leaving nothing and no one behind. Advocates say many of those detained had pending asylum claims, temporary protected status, TPS, or other forms of relief. Under normal circumstances, they would have been given court dates. But the mass sweep bypassed these processes, with detainees loaded directly onto buses headed for processing centers, and, in some cases, straight to airports. The conditions awaiting deportees. Once in custody, detainees face conditions that have been repeatedly criticized by watchdog groups. Overcrowding, limited access to showers, and inadequate medical care are routine complaints. In some facilities, detainees are fed only once or twice a day, and reports of spoiled or contaminated food are common. The recent opening of the massive alligator Alcatraz camp in Florida's Everglades, capable of holding 3,000 to 5,000 people, shows what awaits many deportees. Migrants there have reported power outages, a lack of running water, and food infested with worms. Immigration lawyers struggle to see their clients, and some detainees have been denied critical medications. Advocates fear that New Mexico's deported migrants could end up in similar facilities, far from family, legal aid, and public oversight. The criminal case ICE is highlighting, ICE has pointed to certain cases as justification for the aggressive raids. One example is Jesus Alvarez Sinecio, a 32-year-old Mexican national deported in February. Alvarez had illegally entered the U.S. at least 6 times and racked up convictions for aggravated assault, firearm possession, DUI, and multiple counts of illegal re-entry. ICE officials say removing repeat offenders like Alvarez is essential to public safety. Critics counter that such cases are being used to overshadow the mass arrest of people with no criminal history. In fact, ICE's own data shows that roughly 1/3 of those currently detained have no prior convictions at all, a sharp rise from just 6% earlier this year. Local and political fallout. The New Mexico raids have sparked both outrage and applause. Supporters argue that the operation made communities safer and demonstrated that immigration laws will be enforced. Opponents call it a humanitarian disaster that ripped families apart and denied due process. Local officials in some areas complained they weren't notified ahead of time, leaving them scrambling to explain the sudden disappearance of hundreds of residents. Churches, schools, and small businesses have been thrown into turmoil, with empty pews, missing students, and shuttered storefronts. Nationally, the raids are becoming a political flashpoint. While Republican leaders hail the New Mexico operation as a model for future actions, Democrats remain divided on how forcefully to oppose it. Polling shows public opinion turning against mass deportations, with majorities disapproving of ICE's expanded detention funding. The international ripple effect. The deportees from New Mexico are being sent to multiple destinations: Mexico, Central America, and in some cases, third countries willing to take them under controversial agreements. These deals, like the Asylum Cooperation Agreement with Honduras, often require migrants to seek protection in countries they've never lived in and may not be safe for them. Some deportees could even face transfer to high-security prisons abroad. The U.S. has already sent hundreds of Venezuelan men to El Salvador's Secot prison, a facility notorious for harsh conditions. International human rights groups warn that such transfers may violate treaties against torture and arbitrary detention. What comes next? ICE and DHS officials have made it clear. The New Mexico raids are not an isolated incident but part of a larger strategy to accelerate removals nationwide. With funding secured for years to come, and detention capacity expanding both at home and abroad, more large-scale operations are inevitable. In fact, sources say other migrant encampments in Texas, Arizona, and California are already under surveillance, with clearance operations planned before the year's end. The playbook used in New Mexico, covert monitoring, rapid deployment, and total site clearance, may become the new standard. For the migrants who once called these camps home, the future is uncertain. Some will fight deportation from detention centers, others will arrive in countries they left decades ago, and many will face dangerous conditions without the chance to plead their case in court.